Welcome to Birdville ISD's Guide to the 2019 State Accountability System for Public Schools in Texas. This video is designed for parents, community members, educators, and anyone else who's curious about how TEA determines accountability ratings. Over the next 12 minutes, we'll peel back the curtain on how TEA calculates ratings to highlight features of the system. The 2019 accountability system traces its roots back to 2015 and what was then House Bill 2804. In 2017, the Texas legislature revised the system with House Bill 22, which mandated that public schools be evaluated with traditional A, B, C, D, F grades in 3 domains. The intent of the law is to make school accountability simple and intuitive for stakeholders, but as you'll see, the process of assessing school performance is anything but simple. In 2018, districts received letter grades, while campuses received a rating of met standard or improvement required. In 2019, districts and campuses received a letter grade rating of A through F. To determine those letter grades, TEA began by attaching previously used terminology for consistency with the previous system. Scoring for each letter grade was based on the most familiar point systems traditionally used in schools. House Bill 22 mandated that districts and campuses are rated in 3 domains, similar but not identical to the indices employed in the previous accountability system. TEA's task was to devise a way to score every district and campus on this 100-point scale and assign a rating for each domain, then to establish a method for also assigning an overall rating. For the student achievement domain, TEA awards credit using the Approaches Meets Masters performance standards adopted in 2017. It's actually a simple formula, the mean average of the percent of students scoring at each level or above, which determines the STAAR component raw score. We'll discuss why the term raw score matters later on. This average is simple, but it can also be misleading. Suppose a campus had 100% of its students reach Approaches, which is considered the minimum passing standard by TEA, on all STAAR tests, but only half of them reached Meets, and a quarter reached Masters. The average of those 3 percentages is 58.3, rounded to 58. Mathematically, that 58 may be correct, but it doesn't accurately reflect the Meets and Masters totals. More importantly, it doesn't show that every student in this school passed all their STAAR tests. Now, this is an extreme example. Most of the time, the STAAR raw score will fall close to the Meets percentage, but that number doesn't always tell the full story. The student achievement domain is calculated differently for different entities. For elementary and middle schools, student achievement is completely based on STAAR scores. For high schools and districts, STAAR scores only account for 40% of student achievement. Graduation rate is weighted at 20%. And the remaining 40% is based on a quantity called College, Career, and Military Readiness, or CCMR. CCMR points are awarded according to criteria shown on this chart. A district or campus earns credit for every graduate who meets at least one of the criteria listed. The CCMR raw score is the CCMR points earned as a percentage of the total graduates. This total can also be misleading because a student earns 1 point for meeting only one indicator. Students meeting multiple indicators still earn only 1 point. More importantly, every indicator is considered equal. So a student who earns an associate's degree, the equivalent of 2 years college credit, counts the same as a student who completes a single 3-hour dual credit math course, the equivalent of 1 semester of a college math course. The simplicity of allowing a maximum 1 point per student can understate the performance of higher achieving students. The school progress domain includes 2 components, Part A, academic growth, and Part B, relative performance. Academic growth might be the most complex part of the new accountability system. It's based off 2 quantities derived from STAAR scores in consecutive years. One is the student's performance compared to the previous year. The other is the student's STAAR progress measure, which is calculated using a completely different algorithm. This chart shows the 16 possible scenarios for each student with valid consecutive STAAR scores. 11 scenarios strictly compare last year's score to this year's. The other 5 also factor in STAAR progress measure. The academic growth raw score is the points earned as a percentage of the students with a valid progress measure. This raw score can also be misleading. First, because it excludes some students. For instance, if a student transferred from out-of-state or private school, that student is excluded due to no previous year's STAAR score, regardless of any academic progress the student made in the actual classroom. Second, the chart mixes 2 separate quantities in determining scores. Third, this score does not offer any extra credit for accelerated growth. Students who make greater gains are scored the same as those whose gains are deemed expected. In fact, this scoring method is particularly punitive because a student whose STAAR performance moves backward, even if only because of a single multiple-choice question, earns 0 points towards this score. Perhaps the biggest concern with this methodology is that it attempts to define academic growth solely off of differences in 2 multiple-choice tests covering different curricula taken a full year apart. School Progress Part B Relative Performance is relatively new to TEA accountability. This component is the simpler part of school progress and is predicated on the theory that student achievement and academic disadvantage vary inversely, as shown on this graph. The goal of the calculation process in this component is to evaluate districts and campuses compared to those with similar percentages of economically disadvantaged students, as represented by these 2 red lines. Students with higher economic means, represented by line 1, will inherently perform differently than students with higher economic disadvantage, represented by line 2. Finally, we come to the Closing the Gaps domain, which includes portions of the previous accountability system merged with requirements mandated by the U.S. Department of Education. Closing the Gaps examines performance data in 4 different components across up to 14 different student groups, as shown on this table. In total, up to 84 possible indicators, each with its own target, could be examined. Those indicators are distributed according to the component, and the component score is the indicators met as a percentage of the indicators evaluated. Each component is then weighted based on the entity to calculate the Closing the Gaps raw score. If you've made it this far without getting overwhelmed or bored, congratulations! You probably thought you were done. But now you get to see why we kept mentioning raw scores since back on slide 4. TEA doesn't base the ratings off raw scores themselves. They first have to convert them to scaled scores to fit the 100-point scale. What that means first is determining what's called a cut score using one of these tables. For STAAR or CCMR, for graduation rate, for School Progress Part A and Part B, and for Closing the Gaps. The appropriate cut score table is used to determine which of these 5 formulas is used to calculate the scaled score. Once the scaled scores are determined, TEA can assign the rating for each domain. The overall rating is determined by taking the better scaled score from student achievement or school progress and counting it as 70% of the overall score, with the scaled score from Closing the Gaps accounting for the remaining 30%. Let's look at a sample campus calculation. Scaled scores for each domain are provided in the first column. The next step is to examine parts A and B of school progress. Because 62 on part B is higher, it's used to assign the official rating for school progress. For the overall rating, that 62 is compared with the student achievement scaled score. Because 78 is higher, it's used for 70% of the overall rating. Closing the Gaps is then used for the other 30% of the overall rating. The overall score rounds to 80, which is a B for 2019. But that B rating can also be misleading, because it ignores scaled scores equivalent to F and D in the school progress domain. For another perspective, let's look at a different campus. This campus has higher scaled scores on all domains. But using the same approach, the overall score of 89 also nets a rating of B for 2019. A casual observer checking school ratings on the web might simply see ratings of B for both of these campuses and conclude that their performance is equivalent. Are these letter grades simple? Absolutely. But if you want a truly complete and accurate picture of how a school is doing, you have to look past simple letter grades, just as you would when evaluating how a person is doing at school or in a job. So what's critical to remember about the new accountability system? First, despite the intent of the law, realize that it's still a complex system with a multitude of data points and several layers of calculations. TEA officials did the best they could to use available data and past methodologies to craft a system that boiled all that data down to a handful of letter grades, but in doing so, they had to make compromises to keep it manageable. Those compromises led to imperfections, but that's what happens when you have to simplify statistical analysis. Remember also that the bulk of state accountability data is still derived from a single test administered on a single day each year. It's not like an employee receiving a performance review based on daily data or even a company filing quarterly reports. If you're truly interested in how a district or campus is serving students, feel free to study the accountability domain data, but look also at distinction data, which is compared to demographically similar campuses. Ask your principal for local assessment data and other publicly available reports. Most importantly, visit the school, check out what's happening in classrooms, and ask administrators what you can do to help them succeed. If successful schools depend on schools, parents, and community working together, then accountability has to be about more than just the actions of teachers and staff. For more information about the ratings for a district or campus or the state accountability system in general, visit the URLs listed on screen. If you have further questions or comments about the system, feel free to contact TEA's Performance Reporting Division. Thanks for watching.